Today at shopdap.com, we're going to be doing front brakes, pads and rotors on our B7A4. Okay, so this vehicle does need brakes really only because we either have a stuck caliper or a stuck caliper slide on the driver's side of this car. So we're going to be inspecting that through the process to figure out whether we have an issue with the caliper slide or the caliper itself, and then replacing the pads and rotors to ensure we get everything new on this car after we make our repair. We're going to start by taking off our wheel. We have a 17mm on an impact here. You'd want to break these loose on the ground if you were on the ground. And if you do have a wheel lock key, you are going to want to make sure that you have that either find it in your trunk or whatever to get that off. Our car doesn't have wheel locks, so we don't need to worry about it. Now, if you're not familiar with European cars, they use bolts instead of studs like a lot of Asian and American cars, which means when you take all of the bolts out, you gotta make sure you hang onto the wheel so it doesn't fall on you. And you can just take it down. So here we are with our brake caliper here, the rotor here, and then there's a set screw that holds the rotor on, which we will remove once we are ready to remove the rotor itself. Until then, we're going to start by taking the caliper off, which we're going to look at the back side of the caliper here. So the thing we're going to start by removing is going to be these caps right here and here. And we'll show you the bottom one so you can see that one the best. And all you do is take a small pocket screwdriver and kind of push that off to access the Allen screw that's underneath here. Now we're going to take this top cap off and do the same. Now we can crack our bolts loose. We are also going to remove this spring that kind of keeps tension on the caliper, and you will want to be careful. There is tension on this, so you get to kind of just pry it out and walk it kind of back and forth as you go. Okay, so walk that side down and out, and then you do the same on this side. Here you go. Okay, 7mm Allen. We're going to put this in here to break this loose. And I expect that to be a little bit tighter, and it was not that tight. That one also wasn't that tight. We're just going to loosen these completely until our caliper is loose. Now we're going to also remove this connector here. This is for the brake pad wear indicator. You're going to push down on this tab and then slide that connector backwards. Now you can do this with your fingers, or I'm going to show you how to do it here with a pocket screwdriver. You do have to be careful because you will potentially break these, although this one. So what I did, if you heard that click there, I pushed forward towards me on this, and then I pushed the tab away from me to allow it to release, and then you can kind of wiggle it out. So this connector has to actually turn out of this. There's a tab here that kind of locks it in place. So we're gonna pry back on that. It actually cracked on us, which is fine because we got a new one anyway, new wear indicator, and we can just turn it out and then push it up like that. Normally though, you would just pry that tab back and it will allow it to release from that bracket. So our bolts for the caliper are loose, but one thing that I think is a common problem that people, if you're not familiar, are gonna have is this bolt is kind of captive within this caliper and it needs to slide further away from the brake assembly. The reason why it's gonna hang everything up is because it's stuck in there. So you'll either have to take a socket, your Allen, and kind of put pressure on it in a lateral way and then pull it away, or stick a screwdriver in between, which we're going to try to show you, and actually push the threads back to move it away from there. It's loosened completely, but it's still kind of inserted into the carrier a little bit, which is going to hang this caliper up from just coming straight off. So we're looking through the caliper and the carrier assembly into this. So this is not the normal angle I would go at this thing, but we're trying to show you this. And so I'm just going to take a screwdriver and I push the threads to kind of push it out like that. And then all you're looking to do is clear it. You're not actually looking to remove it from the caliper completely. And we'll do the same thing on the bottom. Now the caliper is ready to come off. We have a bungee cord here. You are going to want a bungee cord, mechanics wire, something to hold this thing up because we're going to be taking off the rotor. Normally you might be able to lay it on top here, although that's sketchy. You need to make sure you support this properly so that you don't destroy your brake lines themselves. So we're going to just use a screwdriver to pop this thing off, and then once we're ready, we'll get this in place. I'm going to actually just get this kind of wrapped around our control arm here to use up some of the slack of this beforehand, because this is a little bit longer than I would probably like it to be, and let those hooks hang there for us to use. And so I'm just going to pry here. These pads seem to be kind of hung up in this assembly here. Make sure you get them to break loose from the carrier itself. So what I'm doing here is I got this screwdriver stuck in between the pad and the caliper here and the carrier, and I'm using it to pry up to push the piston in. And the reason why I'm doing that is because this caliper will not clear the carrier like that easily. So we're doing it, that should be plenty. You can see here, if you don't push that in, this portion will not clear that part of the carrier itself, which is why we needed to do that to be able to get this off. And now we should be able to just wiggle this off. And all right, so now that it's off, you can see we're hanging here and we have our old pads that we can take out. Okay, so now we're gonna break these Caliper Carrier bolts loose. They're 21 millimeters here and here. You are gonna need something that's pretty big. And you'll probably just see me break this bottom one loose because the top ones and the caliper is gonna be in the way. Wow, that's also way easier than I expected. So just so you know, a 21 millimeter bolt should be pretty hard to break loose. That one was not. This one feels a little bit harder, but these are probably gonna be pretty tough to break loose. Which means they may not have been torqued previously. Now we got that bracket loose and we can remove that. Now we're gonna break our Torx loose here, and normally these are pretty tight. I don't expect in this circumstance it's going to be. You can break it loose with a ratchet. If this is something that is in your area, you have a lot of rust and corrosion, this is something that you need to be careful of because that could be a problem. Now you saw it loosen up like that, so a good rule of thumb is to take a wheel bolt and thread it in there. That way the rotor can fall down on that and you don't have to worry about it falling off on you. Something else that you might want to try is, if you're in an area where there's a lot of rust, PB blast this before you start taking it off. And you also can do something like use an impact driver. If you're not familiar with what that is, you can look it up. But impact drivers are really useful for things like these brake rotor set screws, where basically you use a hammer on a specific device that's spring loaded that will turn while you're hammering it loose, and they're great for breaking things like that loose. Now, whenever you're dealing with replacing the rotors, you will want to make sure that the rotors you're putting on are the correct size, so you can lay it on top, and then also just check your bolt holes to make sure they all line up as well. Now, a lot of people are going to want to try to clean this surface up before you go back on. A lot of people do put anti-seize on here. It's usually not necessary, but it's something that you can do to clean everything up to make sure you have a good mating surface. If you have too much rust, it could become a problem for sure. So we are in an area where rust isn't very prevalent, but we're just gonna use Scotch-Brite, get this thing cleaned up a little bit, and then put our rotor on. All right, so we are going to throw this on. I'm gonna do the same thing again with this wheel bolt, just because that set screw can be kind of a pain sometimes to get in there. And that way, that's a little bit easier to thread in. So you can do that just as a kind of safety precaution, and then thread this in. And we'll give you the torque spec for this on screen. Because our vehicle did have wear excessive on this side, we're gonna be inspecting that to look at why. A lot of cars would normally use a caliper slide that's built into the bracket of the caliper carrier. In this case, it's not. It's actually these slide bolts here, these 7 millimeters we broke loose. So these actually come out, and I can tell you from feeling what's there, these things are completely bone dry. So these need to be lubricated, and what I'm gonna do is clean this out first, both of these bushings, and then get this all lubed back up so we can install it. Okay, so you can see I pulled this out of the caliper, and if you look inside, it's kind of hard to see, but this thing is very bone dry in there. So there's some ridges that you can see in there that are intended to kind of hold that grease in. You can see a little bit right there, and those are completely bone dry. So this thing makes sense why it wasn't sliding well, because there's nothing to allow it to slide. So we're gonna lubricate the inside of this thing, clean it out first to get all that gunk out of there, and then go from there. Okay, so what we're gonna show you is removing this bushing so that we can remove it to clean it. And this is something that if yours was too worn, you would definitely want to replace it. We'll link to it in the description where you can find them, but this could rip on you if you're not careful. So basically you got to push it through. So you're going to break it loose around from the edges, push it in with a screwdriver like that as you walk it kind of around, pushing it in, pushing it in, pushing it in, pushing it in. And then you can kind of like push it in and kind of allow it to collapse in all the way. I'm gonna try to push from this back side to get that one in, and then this side as well to kind of push it down in. So if you see there, I have both of them in there. You can see it's kind of pushed in, and you can push it down and then pull it out the back side. So these are the pins that the calipers slide on. I'm just gonna use some Scotch-Brite, clean them up, and then I'm gonna maybe use some brake clean to just get the rest of the stuff off before we reinstall it. But this is certainly a big portion of why this thing was not sliding very well. Okay, so here is our stuff. It's all cleaned up and ready to go in. We are gonna lubricate it, so we'll show you that. First, I'm gonna lubricate inside of these to kind of get as much grease in those ribs as I can, and then we'll actually install these into the caliper and then slide these in kind of at that same time. Okay, so I already put a little bit in there. I'm trying to make as little of a mess as possible. I don't think it's gonna be very successful, so I might just jam this thing in there and then clean it off after the fact. A Q-tip would have worked great, but we're not at a home where Q-tips, I don't shower here very often in the sink like a hobo. I don't have one accessible to me right now. Stick my finger in there just to make sure it's kind of packed in there all the way. Okay, that looks great. It's probably a little excessive, but now I'm just gonna clean off the top of this like so. So what I believe is gonna be the easiest way to work this thing in there is gonna be from the back side here. So we have taken our caliper off of our hanger there, and what I'm gonna do is kind of work one side in and then use it to kind of use a screwdriver to kind of push the other side in. I don't think I'm gonna be able to show you this because I'm gonna be blocking the camera the entire time, but this is basically the gist of what we're gonna do. Okay, so as you can see here, this thing is in. I don't know how well you can see it there, but it's in there. And now one note, you do wanna make sure before you start working that thing in that you've emery clothed the hole and lubricated it, because this thing does not work in there easily. What I did is took a pick like this and I kind of worked it around like this and walked it in while I was doing that. This thing's pretty snug. I would say for most people, they're gonna have a really tough time with this if you're not experienced with something like this, and you're probably gonna rip this thing if you don't know what you're doing. So just be careful if you're planning on taking that out, be aware it's challenging to get back in. You might consider just trying to clean it inside the car. Now we have our Caliper Carrier here. We cleaned this up a little bit with some brake clean, and we're just gonna slide that in place and then put our 2 bolts in. Now we're gonna snug up these Caliper Carriers. These are 21 millimeters, and we'll put the torque spec for these on screen where you can check that out so you can properly torque yours down. Okay, so now we're gonna get our piston pushed in. This is something you have to do so that your thicker brake pads can fit on here and in between the rotor. And so we have a big pair of channel locks. People like to use C-clamps. You do wanna make sure that you don't pinch any of this boot or anything. I'm sure people are upset with me for not putting a block of wood or something in there. There's usually not a lot of pressure required on here. So you gotta make sure you're not pressing on any lines on the back side here. You don't have any brake lines that you're squeezing because you could damage them. And then you just keep kind of pushing this guy in until it sits down. And in our case, we were concerned about it potentially it being unable to move, but in our case, it's for sure is not an issue. So we're ready to go back in with our caliper. All right, now we're gonna go on with our pads. Now, this one snaps in, the one with the wear indicator is the inner one, and then your outer one. So those spring clips snap into that piston there, and so you're just gonna push it in like so till it sits down, and then we're gonna do the same thing on this side. It snaps through this opening here. Oh, wrong way. All right, I'm gonna route this underneath here and then around here. Originally when we took this off, someone had been in here and zip tied this to here. I actually think this is probably the correct method of how it's supposed to go in. And then you can put this on like so. And then you twist this in place to lock it in. So we have this thing all cleaned up. I am gonna put a little light layer of this lube on here so that it's not going into there dry. Obviously, we lube those bushings in there pretty good and clean this stuff up, but just to make sure we got a good coating on there, just wanna get a little bit in there. And all we're gonna do is feed this in here, try not to touch the sides or anything, and get that in like so. Make sure, I'm gonna press it back because I went a little bit too far, and you want that to be able to go in smoothly. And I'm gonna do the same on the other side. And we're gonna go back on with our caliper, and again, if you push that piston in all the way, it should slide on there, no problem, just like that. no issue. The other note, I pushed in the pistons on this with a big pair of channel locks. If you're not familiar, Volkswagen and Audi, and we have DIYs on other cars, they have to be turned in the rear. So you need a special tool for that, which we can link to on our site for the rear of your vehicle. If you're doing rear pads, you need to twist them in and push them at the same time. All right, now we're gonna snug up our 7mm Allens, and we'll give you the torque spec for these on screen. Now that we've tightened those bolts, we can put these caps on. I'm just gonna pop those over to protect those screws. And finally, you're gonna plug in your pad wear indicator. I actually removed this from this bracket too while I was moving some stuff around to make sure I had some clearance. And you're gonna wanna hear kind of an audible click here, although this one's covered in dirt, so it didn't really click. And we're finally gonna put this spring clip on. Generally gonna have some pretty good tension in there. And what you have to do, there's a notch in the actual brake pad clip itself that this goes into. So we gotta have to feed that in there. Wow, just fell in there just like that. Make sure this guy's seated in all the way, which we're all set. Now, another note you do want to do with brakes is have a can of brake clean available to you. Once you've gotten all your greasy handprints and everything all over here, you want to clean all this off. And so your material is all good for your first braking. Now that we've finished everything on the driver's side, we're gonna head over the passenger side and do it, and then we're gonna follow back up with you so that we can pair the driver's side and passenger side brake pads. So if we take a look at our comparison between the pads, these are the ones that are most significantly different. This is gonna be our outer pads. You can see this is the one that was wearing more unevenly, and this one has more wear than this one. The inner pads, actually, if we take a look at them, they're pretty similar. It's actually hard to kind of distinguish the difference on these to know which one would be significantly more worn than the other. So I would say that thing had some issues with the slides binding, but nothing significant, and we should solve our problem. But we are going to keep an eye on our issue just to make sure that we don't see any uneven pad wear going forward. Now, the last and probably the most important part of a brake job, other than making sure you tighten everything properly and all that, is pumping the brake pedal once you're done. So whenever you're done, we push all those pistons back on the brake calipers. You have to make sure you pump the brake pedal before you get in the car, start the car, do anything that you need to do to try to move the car, because otherwise you'll push it and it'll go straight to the floor like it did the first time I just pushed it. Once you have a firm brake pedal, we're all set and you can go for a test drive. Thanks so much for watching. The parts that we used in this video will be linked in the description, as well as the video that we did on this car. We did an inspection video on this car that covers all the things wrong with it that we found, because this car was a very cheap buy. Make sure you check that out. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.